Penitentiary designed for solitary confinement. About 80,000 men and women were incarcerated in this building over the course of a 142-year consecutive history. It didn't close until 1971 when the last person was transferred out. The building was abandoned. It was slated for demolition. At one point, it looked almost like a Mayan ruin here in the heart of Center City, Philadelphia. But eventually, we did open a museum. The museum opened in 1984. Most of our visitors today take an audio tour. We are increasingly interested, though, in discussing issues close. We believe that criminal justice reform is the civil rights issue of our generation, and we take that responsibility very seriously here at Eastern State. We hire people who've been incarcerated onto our tour program. We don't advertise this very much because we just don't think that it's appropriate, but there are people on our interpretive team who've been incarcerated. We work with a lot of artists, many of whom these days have also been incarcerated. This is Jesse Crimes' piece, which he created while he was incarcerated in federal prison. We have 3 new art installations that just opened last week. Be happy to show this to you on another occasion. Tonight's not the night. We built a giant graph showing the rate of incarceration in U.S. history. It opened in 2014, and a companion exhibit in 2016 called Prisons Today, which won a bunch of awards, and we're very proud of it as well. We're also very proud that even as we've asked our visitors to consider some more and more complicated subject matter, our attendance has continued to thrive. Our attendance is now 4 times higher than it was 10 years ago, even as we've begun to ask visitors to consider some really troubling aspects of the criminal justice system in the United States today. Our current project is called Hidden Lives Illuminated. It's a 3-year project coming to a close now. We've been teaching animation and narration and story writing to people who are incarcerated, to artists who are currently incarcerated. All of our students have made films about their lives, and we're going to project those films onto the front wall of Eastern State Penitentiary this summer. It opens on August 15th, runs for 29 consecutive nights, films by people who are currently incarcerated on the front wall. We're also working on a visitor center, which will be in the front area of the building. We're going to break ground on that in November, so stay tuned for that. We have a very active membership program. Anyone here members? Raise your hand if you're a member. I'm a member. Thank you. Our members make all sorts of things possible, including this speaker series, which remains free. So thank you to our members. Joel is here from our membership, from our advancement team. They can tell you more about that program after the presentation tonight if you are interested in joining up and becoming a member. This is the Searchlight series. The Searchlight series is always the first Tuesday of the month. It's always at 6 p.m. It's always free. It always involves, we always bring in people to discuss some aspect of the criminal justice system today. So you're in the right spot. We really do read those surveys. If there was one, we handed one on the way in. We read them and we select future speakers based on the opinions of the people in the room. So please do let us know. You can also sign up for the Searchlight mailing list on that as well. Next month, we have an old friend, Ann Parsons. I've known Ann for many years. She has a new book out. It's called Decarcerating America, Efforts to Close Mental Hospitals and Prisons. That is the June Searchlight series speaker. She's going to be great. But tonight we have another old friend, Johnny Perez. Johnny Perez is the Director of U.S. Prison Programs for the National Religious Campaign Against Torture, an organization committed to ending practices it deems cruel, inhumane, and degrading, including solitary confinement. He works to empower faith leaders and directly impacted communities to engage in advocacy for criminal justice reform. However, turns out that Johnny's driving down from Albany, where he is. Johnny's here! Johnny's here! Johnny's become a personal friend, an old friend of the project. Ron was ready to pinch hit for you. I'm glad, though, that you're here. Without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Johnny Perez. Good.
And I'm glad my supervisor was there to pinch it. That's what I'm talking about, teamwork. You know, I tell you. First of all, thank you so much. Thank you. So thank you so much for coming. It was Tuesday. It's been a long day. I'm actually coming from Albany, where we met with legislators. Albany, New York. We met with legislators trying to forward a piece of legislation that we had, which limits the amount of days that people spend in solitary, who gets to go in the first place. More importantly, the correctional question, right? About the correctional question about, like, well, what do we do with these people? We can't put them in solitary. the alternative. What is the alternative? And I'll tell you a sneak peek is if we let everyone in solitary, guess what? The increases in violence, you won't see any increases in violence. Colorado just recently, not too long ago, did it and didn't see huge spikes in violence. So there's a huge misconception about who's in there, why they're there, how long they're there, so on and so forth. So I hope to try to shed light on some of that. And like Sean was saying, he kind of rattled a lot of my professional accomplishments. But when people ask me, Johnny, how did you come to the work? I always tell people, well, my arrested officer brought me to the work. In the sense of that I spent 13 years incarcerated. When I was 21, I applied a criminal solution to my problems and I robbed them. So I ended up getting sentenced to 15 years in prison plus another 5 years on parole. It was 2 days after my daughter was born. So you can imagine coming home 13 years later to a little girl who's 13 going on 50, trying to navigate all of those things. But I'm going to get a little bit into that a little bit later. So I talk a lot about solitary confinement. I spent 3 years in the box. And for this conversation, I thought that actually kind of changed my approach a little bit. And, I want to talk about solitary, but I want to talk more about our values through the lens of solitary. Because I think that allows us to kind of really understand a little bit more versus the more technical stuff, like this is what it looks like, this is what it feels like. So in so really asking the question, the deeper question is solitary reflective of our shared values? And more importantly, that question, in order to answer that question, we have to clarify exactly what our shared values are. When I was incarcerated for a long time, I thought it was a curse at the time, but it actually came out to be a gift because I was able to, I was sent to about 8 or 9 different prisons throughout the 13 years of my incarceration. All different levels of security. And, although at the time, sometimes things happen, you're like, why is this happening? Why is this happening? And then years later, you're like, wow, I'm actually glad that happened because that gave me such an expansive view about the system, the policies that impact the folks that are there, and most importantly, like who's actually in there. And I can tell you, when I was first sentenced, it's hard to take 15 years. The judge is sitting up there. Johnny Perez, I sentenced you to 15 years to be served in a maximum state correctional facility in New York State. And at first, it doesn't necessarily click in. You're like, they'll let me go. They're just trying to scare me, Then a year passes by, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, 6 years. You think that, well, actually you come to the realization that no, you have to do this time, A. B, no one's gonna knock on the door and say, hey Johnny, by the way, we just messing with you, man. You can lay down. And I have to really do this time. And what does that mean? But deeper questions about why am I here? Really, why am I here? I broke the law. That's an obvious one, right? But what actually gave me, or how did I give myself permission to break the law? I think that was a deeper question for me. And I'd say solitary, there's a lot of time. And you get a lot of time to think. You get a lot of time to imagine. You get a lot of time to overthink. You get a lot of time to sleep. And when you get tired of sleeping all day, you're also up all night. But you do tend to have these thoughts, and you spend an incredible amount of time in such deep type of introspection, but also just reflection about a number of different things. And one of the things that I reflected on was exactly what my values are. Johnny, what are your values? For a long time I thought that I valued family, but then my actions contradicted that. How can I value family, yet break the law and essentially take myself away from my family in a sense? And that's independent of how messed up the system is. This is talking about me and my own personal decisions, right? And I realized that a lot of the values that I have absorbed, were not really sort of like mine to begin with in a sense. I inherited them, from my parents, from the people that I grew up with, and I found out that the things that I thought that I valued, my actions showed me that I actually didn't. And there was this cognitive dissonance, if you would. Oops. Can you tell I'm not an Apple person? I have a Samsung, everything in my house. Okay. So, I do want to set the scene because it's important for me, that you understand the emotional environment, if you will, the spiritual environment that was happening in order for me to go to a place where I was actually even thinking about values and even looking at them. And you know, a lot of my cellmates used to think that I was crazy or that I was losing it, you know, and I would literally, I think about 8 years in, I got to a point where I was just literally interviewing people. You know, why'd you come back? Why'd you do this? Why'd you do that? Not because I aspired to be a researcher, but because I wanted to find out why everybody was getting locked up so I don't follow their footsteps and not come back. But in this kind of like emotionally pressurized environment, if you will, you know, I spent a total of 3 years inside of this space. You know, I'm 6 feet tall. So if I stretch both of my hands out, I can literally touch both walls. I used to sleep with my legs tucked a lot because, again, the bed is shorter than I'm tall. Maybe it's probably like 5 feet long. I put there 23 to 24 hours a day because, you know, we hear the normal 24 hours a day, but in practice, and anyone who spent time in solitary, or even in the jail setting, we know that policies in practice and policies in theory are two separate things. So on paper it's 23, but in practice it's 24 when you find out that you have to be fully dressed, standing at your door, whether it's 6 o'clock in the morning, 5 o'clock in the morning, or sometimes just be up whenever they decide to yell, hey, I'm walking, and if you caught me, you caught me. If not, then tomorrow you'll get another chance. But in practice, a lot of men and women find themselves in isolation actually for 24 hours a day. You know, and when you look at the fact that in the winter you're only allowed to wear one layer, a lot of people actually refuse recreation because what am I going to do in 10-degree weather for an entire hour? I might as well stay inside. So through the winter month, you see that people actually isolated for long periods of time, for weeks at a time. You know, no meaningful human contact was one of the most difficult things. You know, like, you know, here we are out in the world, right? And you walk by me and you don't say nothing to me. I'm not going to get mad at you. Oh, Ron's having a bad day. You know, but when the only person who you come in contact with, the person who you depend on for everything, I mean, everything, toilet paper, tissue, food, conversation, even in some contexts is eye contact, which is something that we usually don't think about. But, you know, I wrote about it at the time in my journals, and I've been thinking about it more and more, but the impact that, you know, the lack of eye contact has on an individual who is inside of these isolated spaces for such a long time, where the only person you come in contact with does not at the very least acknowledge your humanity. And that's independent of what you did to get here. You know, because if one thing that I know about solitary is that solitary is a prison within the prison. You know, and one of the things that I tell to audiences across the country is to understand that prison is the punishment. And incarceration and solitary is a punishment on top of that. So what does that mean? That means that if I spent 13 years in prison, 13 years away from my daughter, 13 Christmases, 13 summers, 13 July 4ths, 13 Miss Thanksgivings, you know, all those years that she could, you know, so on and so forth, like that in itself is a punishment. And I think that other countries are better examples than we are in that space. You know, we look at countries like Sweden, Norway. You know, when you walk inside of a cell and you think that you're in a college dorm, when you're actually in a prison cell. Why? Because they recognize that, you know, prison is the punishment, A. B, the purpose of their prisons is to bring you back into a space where you'll be able to make better decisions, so on and so forth. In a sense, it's not punitive as us Americans are. We have this punitive paradigm where we see everything as a nail, and we tend to be a hammer. And if you're a hammer, you tend to see everything as a nail. And solitary is sort of like that. When we respond, you know, to cannabis use, which is the main reason why I was there for all of that time. And I'll say something about that, and I always say the same thing, that, you know, I don't promote drug use, cannabis use, X, Y, Z, but there's nothing like getting 15 years in jail that's gonna make you want to smoke a joint. And the correctional department's response, you know, is to place you inside of a space pretty much like the one I'm describing here. But even on top of that, not to be able to give you the programs and services that you would need for drug addiction, so on and so forth. And then later on, of course, when you go to the parole board, they say, hey, why didn't you take this drug program? You should have took it by now. And you find out you're in solitary, well, here's 2 more years, despite the fact that you didn't have no control over the program was accessible to you or not. Right? So again, I want you to ask yourself the big question about what is the purpose of solitary? Or better yet, what is the purpose of prison, which is a bigger question, right? And what are the values in which we can achieve that purpose, assuming that the purpose is correct in a way. And I may not be the person to say what's correct and what's not, but I am trying to be here to kind of challenge your thinking in a sense. Some other things that I really want to highlight from this list that were really difficult, really challenging, not only for myself, but for a lot of people that I either did time with or now I have met in my professional capacity, going inside of these prisons and having conversations with men. I haven't been to a women's prison yet, but conversations with men and the treatment they get there. And the lack of intellectual stimulation, of course, you find yourself reading toothpaste ingredients, and I've read the dictionary about 3 or 4 times, and I always joke about reading War and Peace because it was the only book inside of the cell. So there's that thirst for intellectual stimulation, there's that thirst for human contact, some type of human acknowledgement, and that in itself does have psychological ramifications. In fact, there's very recent studies now that have been done on lab rats. In fact, not too long ago, Sean, did we present that here? There's been recent studies actually did it on lab rats. They actually get IRB approval, where some of the preliminary results show that solitary actually alters your brain wiring and chemistry in a sense. And it says a lot. If we have, I would say we have irrefutable evidence. But for those who are not convinced, if we have even more irrefutable evidence, we have to ask the bigger question that if we know that we are consciously damaging people, right? Then what do we do with that information? If the purpose of prison is to rehabilitate, right? Why? Because we know that 95% of the people who are currently incarcerated are coming right back. They're going to serve your food. They're going to drive your cars. You may even be working for one, right? So right, we're coming back into this community. So the question is, what kind of neighborhood do I want to have? A, is the purpose of prison serving that? B, and is it in line with our shared values? And a lot of times you'll reach this cognitive dissonance in a sense. And I like to use the word cognitive dissonance. I was really impressed by the first time that I actually came across it in a college, in a prison college room, a classroom with other 25 men who were also studying psychology, and this idea that there is this internal battle between belief and action, or how can we hold two things together? And sometimes we have to change one of the two in order for us to feel at peace with ourselves. And I used to think about that and I call him Officer Stevens. I used to think about that when Officer Stevens used to walk by every day, and I come in contact with him, and we would look at him how does that look for you at work every day? And then of course you got a lot of time to think, so you start to think about, how can we give ourselves permission to be able to dehumanize someone or to turn a blind eye to their plight? A, and then B, very randomly, the guy who works in Texas, who works for the death penalty, who presses the syringe like that's his job. I wonder how he wakes up every morning, knowing that today's the day I may kill someone. And how does that conflict with our shared values and individuals' values? And what kind of values allow an individual to say, I'm going to kill this person, or better yet, I'm going to place this person in such an oppressive and depressive state that he sort of kind of like deserves it in a sense. And I did highlight some of these values, right? We value community and family, except that, our criminal justice system actually breaks up families, right? In a number of different ways, right? With the sentencing them to long prison terms where long outside of their counties. I remember my daughter's mother having to travel 10 hours just to come see me for a few hours. Here we are, there's a lot of different prisons that are restricting in-person visits. There's denials of home addresses by parole. Here it is, you grew up in this household, and because you were arrested in this neighborhood now, because of whatever policies, you can't go back to the house that you lived in, so you're forced to go into a shelter. So how can we value community and family but yet have these policies, right? And then moving forward, how can we value second chances, but on the other hand, have perpetual consequences of having a criminal record. You know, by one study, it was 47,000 collateral consequences to a criminal record. You can't possibly cop out to all of those things or plead deal. Those things, in fact, you can't even possibly even foresee them in the moment, right? You know, here it is, we value freedom, you know, but yet we also, again, like, you know, we further harm people with their mental health and so on and so forth, and re-traumatize them, and understanding that incarceration in itself causes trauma, and then solitary on top of that is trauma on top of trauma, on top of trauma, on top of trauma, on top of trauma. And for the folks who are released directly from this type of space into society, you know, we have to ask the question, are we really doing the best that we can to give them the best tools that they need in order to achieve or to become the best version of themselves in a sense? And holding these two dichotomies together, right? How can we, you know, we value compassion and justice, but sometimes what happens when our perception of justice, you know, conflicts with compassion, you know? If justice looks like 20, 30 years for, I don't know, let's take a Florida case, 3 strikes out, you stole a pizza, it's 20 years, right? That's justice in California, right? Versus our ideas of compassion. You know, our ideas of dignity that everybody's is born with equal worth and humanity, if you will, but this idea of equal opportunity, right? Like, we value you, but hey, you have a chance to get everything else like everyone else. I mean, everybody in here has a chance to get, I don't know, $1 million house or become president. Chances are, a lot of us, many of us won't. You know, equal opportunity does not equal equality, just to be clear on that. You know, how do we balance love and retribution, right? How do we balance humanity and our ideas about humanity with capitalism and our thirst for continuously profiteering? I mean, in a lot of cases, when we're talking about the system off the bodies of Black and brown folks who carry the brunt of the criminal justice system and its policies. So at some point, Officer Stevens said, "What's your problem? Why you keep messing with me?" Because at some point I said, "Well, you're not going to look at me, you're not going to talk to me," so I would curse him out every now and then just to get a reaction. And one day he did. He gave me the best reaction. He just, like, I think he was holding it in for like 6 months. He let me have it for like a good 5 minutes. And I felt good. I felt acknowledged. Even if he was angry at me, I knew that I was an individual that he felt angry at, and humans do get mad at each other. I felt seen, I felt heard, you know? And then the ensuing days, mind you, this is a 10-month stint, which is the longest time I spent one time in solitary. He did say, "Hey, you know, you have to understand, like, you know, you harm someone, you know?" And that's a question that I think about and I consistently think about, because we can't talk about the injustices of the system on the folks who've been ensnared, who in some cases are victims themselves, right? When we see violence, we see trauma. You know, what if I told you that I didn't learn how to pull a gun on you until someone pulled a gun on me? You know, I started carrying a gun at 15 years old, illegally, because I come from a community where we didn't trust police officers. I see my friend shot in front of me, so why would I call you? You know, with the harm, the real harm that I've actually caused, you know? And what I realized is that it's sort of similar in how the systems creates these policies in a way in which my process that I had to take to break the law, right? Like, what was my internal process when I decided that, you know, I wanted to forcibly take someone's property? And in order for me to do that, I had to dehumanize an individual. I had to look at them as if they wasn't even people, even worthy of even having this in some cases, even to the point where I had to disillusion myself. And the question that, you know, Officer Stevens had, when you harm someone, it was, the deeper question was, he was really giving himself permission to treat me this way. See, because if I see you as a person who harmed someone who is deserving of some type of retribution and justice, then I feel justified. In fact, I feel like it's my job and my duty. And I can't tell you how many correctional officers I met. I mean, think about it, 13 years, right? Like, I'll talk to you at the beginning of your job. Here it is, you're 10 years in and I'm still here. We're like buddies now. So you go through 2 divorces. I know what you like to eat for lunch. I probably know more about you than you know about me, and vice versa. You know, and one common thing that I did see is that a lot of correctional officers would justify their behavior, which in other contexts would even warrant imprisonment in itself, you know, with this idea that, you deserve to get treated like this because you broke the law. And how is that different from other countries which say, hey, wow, you don't deserve to do this. If you broke the law, let me give you a hug because you obviously need it. And we can hold you accountable because accountability is a real thing. We just can't have a society where people just run around without accountability. And that's just real. You know, I definitely sat across some people and I'm like, I do not, you need to take a time out. You know, so we do have to have accountability, but not at the cost of undermining our humanity. Does that make sense? We can hold people accountable, but not treat them inhumane in the process. If my daughter comes home tonight, you know, on a high of weed, for, you know, to use my own example, you know, I'm not gonna stuff her in the closet for a year, right? And feed her 3 meals a day, the last meal at 4 o'clock, windowless closet, don't look at her, don't talk to her, don't acknowledge her. That sounds like child welfare, child neglect. It sounds like a few felonies in there. And I already have a record, so I'll be doing all of that time. But yet we give ourselves permission to do that legally. How is that possible? You know, the other day an article came out, and I'm kind of veering off the script, but you know, these correctional officers were arrested for conducting illegal cavity and body searches. You know, and it made me think about all of the times that my daughter visited, and because my daughter's mother was, you know, like whatever their policy was, my daughter at this time was forced to take her diapers off to make sure that there was nothing smuggled in there. Think about that. What I'm saying is that my daughter was strip searched before she was able to walk because her only crime was that she was born to a father who made shitty decisions. And that is the type of system that we have that sometimes it gets lost inside of these conversations about, I mean, I can see you guys' faces like, well, I would never do that. But yet, and I'll tell you, I just came, I'll tell you these politicians, and with respect to the legislators who support the movement, but hey, y'all know how y'all do. You know, I lost my train of thought. Yeah, this idea of giving ourselves permission, so on and so forth. Yeah, okay, yeah. So missing those layers that we don't often peel back, that we often just look at the individual and say, wow, well, you know something, well, that'll never happen to me because I'll never do that. Or I remember, I tell you how many times the course officer said, if you can't do the time, what? Yeah. Except how do I tell that to somebody who was wrongfully convicted of a crime that he did not commit, wrongfully accused and arrested of a crime that he did not commit, spent 2 years in solitary, 3 years total, and then one day the DA says, hey, man, we messed up. Man, you got the wrong guy. You can leave now. And he's like, hey, I'm 18 years old. I've been here since I was 15, 16 years old. I missed my prom. My girlfriend left me, right? I don't feel right in the head, in a sense, and that's sort of like some of his words, you know? And then commit suicide. And then a year later, his mother literally dies from a broken heart. You know, so it's like, I get it, don't do the crime, don't do the time, but how do I explain that to someone like him, right? And if we understand that people can get ensnared in the system, do we create a blanket and just capture everyone and say, hey, well, just a collateral consequence, if you will, you know, or or are we more conscious about who's in there, how they get in there, right? And more importantly, how do we keep them from coming back? And I always use Alfred Wilcox as an example because here's a man, right? I mean, I was in solitary for like very minor things, you know. But you know, Albert, he landed in solitary. You know, he was involved in a situation where a correctional officer lost their life. You know, and that correctional officer will never get his life back. You know, and the state's response was to literally incarcerate him again inside of the incarceration for 44 years. You know, and I hope to meet him one day. And Sean, if you haven't had him here, you totally have to have him and invite me because I want to listen. But, you know, like at what point does the punishment become worse than the actual, well, just as bad or if worse than the actual crime in a sense? You know, and if so, then at what point do we have these diminishing returns, if you will? You know? Dehumanization, this is actually, I didn't put that in, but this is actually my colleague, Laura Downton, who is our campaign strategist. and actually one of the most wonderful folks who I've met. And actually I stepped into her role, and then she's still with us. But no more do you see this dehumanization in the architecture and the language and the commodification of convicted people. And when you look at the architecture, right, these small cells, small windowless drag colors. I can't tell you the first time that I was actually like let out of the cell, and then even into general population, when you see colors that you don't see inside of isolation, they're very bright. You tend to look at them a lot because they seem also like it's like your senses are heightened in a sense. You know, very bright colors. Some colors you don't even gonna see in prison at all until you get released. You're like, wow, it's been a while since I've actually seen that color, like orange and blue in some states, depending on whatever the correctional officer's wearing. You know, the constant light stays on. I know many people who actually their eyes have been damaged. You know, to this day I wear glasses. I don't have them now. I lost them. But think about it, right? You're sitting 10 months in a 6x9 cell, right? Windowless in some cases, or in one cruel example, I had a window, but when you open the window, it's facing a brick wall. I don't know which one's worse. But you really can't really see no more than 8 feet in front of you, right? And mine longest stint was 10 months, you know, but I know people who spent 5, 10, 15 years in those settings. I mean, Alpha Wolf, I spent 44 years in those settings. And what does that do to our vision, right? What does that do to our self-talk? A lot of other things. So really being conscious of that architecture, say, well, you don't deserve a window. You don't deserve direct sunlight. You know, you don't deserve to stand on your feet when you get your food. Some prisons and some cells, the slot in which they open to give you food is so low that you literally either have to bend down. In some cases, if the nurse comes to take blood, you literally have to get on your knees. I know that's true because I've had to get on my knees to get like a TB test, get blood taken and stuff like that, because it's just impractical to do that. The dehumanization of it all. We see it in the language, right? Both outside in the world and inside of prison, right? These conversations about, convict, right? How many bodies do you have? I have 50 heads for you. Inmate, your name is no longer Johnny Perez. Your name is now inmate number 0185068, which I sometimes play as my lotto number. That is real talk. I think anyone who's ever been fully incarcerated paid the numbers. And I'll keep playing. We hear this conversation about, you're an ex-con, this prisoner, right? And like I mentioned the last time that I was here, that until we see people as people, we won't treat them as such. With respect to, World War II, right? One of the things that I learned throughout that time, actually from reading Viktor Frankl's book, A Message from Meaning. If you've never read it, read it. It's the best 68 or about 100 pages I've ever read. And, in order for us to give permissions for us to really literally harm and oppress an entire group of people, entire class of people, not because of what they've done, but because of who they are, again, we had to give ourselves permission. You see some of that language changing during those times, right? Whether it was through textbooks, it was the news media, so on and so forth, because we tend to internalize a lot of the language that's actually told to us. And you don't have to go that far. I mean, you can just turn on the news today, turn on Fox, if you will, and you'll hear some of the same rhetoric, except that the language is a little bit different. And these labels that I shared there are examples of that, right? Because there's things, can I pass a policy for ex-con that's going to keep him away from schools where he may harm kids? Or can I pass the same policy, for someone's granddaughter? One and the same, but we give ourselves permission if it's an ex-con or convict, but not if it's somebody's son, father, or mother. Nowhere else do we see the commodification of convicted people, and of course private prisons, right? And I did put this note up there, right? No involuntary servitude except for what? Anyone recognize that? Can I get a hand somewhere? 13, what? I got some veterans in here. I usually say it, right? But right? So we technically outlawed slavery in this country, except for that fine print. It's like that fine print. It's like getting a free trial and you don't turn it off. You're like, wow, I didn't know that it was going to charge me all this money months later. And here it is, all of these years we thought that slavery was outlawed, or involuntary servitude, right? Choose your language, except for those who've been convicted of a crime. right? And I'm not a conspiracy theorist, you know, but that does stick out for me a whole lot, because I'm also a person who worked for 15 cents an hour with no sick pay, no vacation time, no rollover days, no bereavement days, none of that. In fact, if you refuse program in prison, you can get put in solitary. And I don't know if that's not involuntary servitude, I don't know what is. Right? And if you want even further with that, there's a great movie in Netflix, which I'm sure many of you heard, 13th, which actually kind of outlines how the system has actually morphed and changed and evolved. You know, and it challenges us to think, do we need a better system, or do we even need one at all? And how are other societies holding folks accountable without these same kind of settings? And of course, I love to read. So I came across, of course, Brian Stevenson, which kind of, he really fleshed out some of this. And this is a quote that I actually have on my desk that I think about. But whenever society begins to create policies and laws rooted in fear and anger, there will be abuse and injustice. That is so deep on so many different levels. And I want you guys to check out, because nowhere else do you see fear. I mean, you hear fear, right? You hear anger, some of the rhetoric. And some of us get very passionate about the things that we care about, but not many of us get passionate about it at the expense of others. It's as good as it can possibly get. So you can easily Google this video. Just Google prison auction. And some of it is shocking, right? I want you to guess what it is that they're talking about.
The detention center that I'm going to sell today really is state of the art. It's as good as it can possibly get. You have the people coming into that pipeline, so you have an endless supply of product. No matter what your business is.
I don't think I heard him. What did he say?
The people coming into that pipeline, so you have an endless supply of product. No matter what your business is, what you're looking for, we will have a steady supply of people in America to build this facility.
Starting better 5 minutes. How can you guarantee that regardless of what happens in this country, we will have a steady supply of product? It's language, not mine, right? We talked about dehumanizing language, right? Because there's a lot of things I can do to a product that I can't do to Ron, But more importantly, right? Like we get the dehumanization part, that's the obvious part. But how can he guarantee a potential customer or investor an endless supply of product through that pipeline? And it's not a coincidence that, a day after the current president was elected, that private stock skyrocketed 500%. So if you had $1, the day after Trump was elected, that dollar was worth 500. And that's very attractive for a lot of folks, even at the expense of valuing someone's humanity, or even in some cases, right, we're talking about values of contradicting our own values. And how do we balance that? How do we balance compassion and justice with, hey, give me $1 now, I'll give you $500 later? Or like I mentioned, the other one, humanity with capitalism. I don't know a lot of the answers. But what I do know, I like to take a lot of something. And I think about this young person in Indiana, that's Indiana, and he said, "You're the first Black person I met in real life." And he gave me a hug, and I like, and when somebody hugs me, I tell you, after being deprived of human contact for a long time, I feel it in my toes. And this young kid was actually like happy, and I felt his happiness, But that comment resonated with me the entire ride home, because I'm like, damn, you're 15 years old, and this is the first time that you meet a person of color, a Black person, in person, And then I also thought, and then I drew these random parallels with how many correctional officers did I meet upstate who had never come in contact with a person of color outside of a correctional setting. And what impact did that have in our relations and interacting with each other? No wonder you can't give me an extra tray. No wonder you may fear me if all the information you have from me is based on whatever you get on the screen. In fact, you should fear me. I always think about the time I was flying from Cali to New York, where I live at, and the woman actually grabbed her purse on my way to the bathroom. 30,000 feet ahead. Like, what am I gonna do, right? Am I gonna just grab your purse and like skydive into wherever, right? But this visceral kind of response, without truly even knowing who I am or anything about me except anything that you can tell from just like looking at me. And I travel just like any other person. Sweatpants, t-shirt, you put the thing on, it's a long ride, you know? So that resonated with me, and I don't know if it was immediate, but part of the work that I'm doing now, you know, at the National Religious Campaign Against Torture, is that I'm convinced, just like Brian Stevenson is convinced, that because it wasn't until me and Officer Stevens got to really know each other and talking that he felt free to actually engage me. So much so, you know, that he ended up giving me extra trays, and that's a big thing in prison. You get an extra tray, you're like the man or the woman. You're rocking, you know. And had that conversation. So how can we expose more people to that young kid in rural Indiana who said, "This is the first time I've ever met a black person in person in real life," you know? But more importantly, how do we you know, build the capacity of those folks who have been solitary survivors, so they have the courage, so they walked away, you know, trying to make sense of the harm that's also been done to them, in a way in which will educate others. And that's not an easy feat, you know. Now, I'm truly convinced that, you know, humanizing solitary survivors, you know, and building the capacity to lead, of course, and also give them the sense of control over their own narratives. And Nafisa, who is one of our solitary survivors, former incarcerated leader, she is amazing, out of New Jersey. You know, she saw that being transferred into other areas of her life. So her ability to walk inside of a legislative office and say, "Hey, you know, I was a woman who," and like, you can straight Google her or her story, but I'm a woman who was held in solitary while I was expecting, who was strip searched every day, and a lot of these other things, and how that confidence transferred into job interviews and saying, "Hey, no, this is the salary that I deserve," or being able to communicate in your personal life or with friends, you know. And it's funny because by sharing my story, or people sharing their stories, we give the listener the opportunity to practice empathy. And I believe that one of the characteristics which truly makes us human is the ability to place ourselves in other people's shoes and feel what they feel and see what they see, and hurt the way that they hurt, but also be happy like the way that they're happy. You know, emotions are contagious. You know, so are perceptions. And I can't tell you how many times I've had talks, and afterwards, you know, that mother who I probably stereotype, right? Because it's not just one way, I stereotype, we all do. And she's like, "Hey, like, my son just went through the exact same thing," and I have to step back and like, "Not you, you know, but yes, you, right?" Because with 2.3 million people who are incarcerated in this country, right, about another 100,000 people, you know, in solitary, about another 70 million people with a criminal record on file, right, or another 15 million people on probation or parole, chances are we're more alike and impacted by a lot of these issues than we may think. You know, I would even argue that most of us in this room, you know, either have been touched by the system, impacted by the system, or have family members impacted by the system because it's so insidious. And I want to open up for questions in a minute. Sharing those narratives by amplifying their voices and creating opportunities, you know, for solitary survivors to share their experiences. And this is Felix Colon during Solitary Week. And if you don't know Felix, you'll probably be afraid of him. He's rough around the edges. He talks really strong, you know. But if you get to know him, he's like the biggest teddy bear, you know. And you're actually safer with him than not with him, because he's the guy who's going to jump in front of a knife because he's so fearless in a sense. But he also has his own values that he abides by, you know. And here it is, he's engaging these young students. Actually, two of them were future FBI agents. And in this case, I took the picture of Felix and saying, why would you want to arrest your own people? And I remember that. Moving forward. Oh, can I do it again? I think we'll go ahead and get it back. Okay. Okay, I see it now. Okay, I got it. Okay, thank you. We also, so in addition to building the capacity of solitary survivors, right, training them to not only tell their stories, but also teaching them about the legislative process, teaching them the politics of politics, but more importantly, campaign work, community organizing, a lot of things that we're not necessarily naturally inclined to coming out of prison, in addition to that, also sharing their narratives and sharing their stories using, technology. We have the virtual reality, and I'll tell you something about the virtual reality. It's that if you've never been inside of a cell, we try to bring the cell to you, so you can actually have this immersive experience with solitary. It's very, very engaging in the sense that we've been able to actually mobilize and take these small digital cells, if you will, literally across the country to bring the cells to people, to bring the cell to like that young kid who probably never even seen a cell before, anything like that. Recognize that picture, Sean? But it's not just working with folks who've been impacted and their communities. It's also working with the other side. It's also working with corrections. I actually highlighted a quote by Rick Ramesh, who is one of the correctional leaders that I respect in this space. He said, "Can you imagine spending years without having regular social interaction or without full access to the basic human activities like showering and exercising?" Some boxes you get 2 showers a week, some you get 3 showers a week. When did it become okay, right? It sounds like a value question there, right? To lock up someone who is severely mentally ill and that the demons chase him around in the cell. What is wrong with us, I asked. And this he did after he spent time in solitary himself. He's put himself in solitary for a day because he said, well, what are the advocates complaining about? This can't be that bad. He didn't finish the entire day. He walks out of his cell saying, we need to release people out of here. And literally walked to every person's cell and said, when was the last person this person received a misbehavior? When was the last time this person received a misbehavior report? If it was more than 6 months ago, let them out. The concern was that fear narrative, right? But they're going to kill everyone. What are they going to do? I said, well, if they break the rules, we can always put them back. It's our jail. I don't necessarily agree with that line of thinking, but hey, got them out, right? And now Colorado leads the country in the least number of people that's incarcerated in solitary. Because a correctional leader decided to go against the grain of maybe his own staff, maybe popular opinion, and say, we don't need to have this. And lo and behold, we didn't see an increase in violence happen at all. So it means collaborating with correctional officials, and in that sense, along with Rick Ramesh and Craig Haney, who's there, and others, I myself and I represent NERCAT on the Safe Alternatives, Safe Segregation Initiative out of the Vera Institute of Justice, and it's basically an initiative that connects correctional officials with advocates and tries to find some middle ground around the torture of it. There's a few other layers there, a lot of politics, but it's such a cross collaborative group of folks that if there's a conversation that needs to be had in Nevada or something like that, I feel comfortable reaching out to the commissioner in Nevada based on a lot of relationships and say, hey, can we have this conversation, so on and so forth, to try to bridge the gap between the advocates and correctional staff, which don't always get along because it kind of seems like they're natural enemies, but they actually don't. They're actually not. When we look at the fact that correctional officers are also harmed by incarceration, how they have some of the highest alcoholism rates, highest divorce rates. I'll never forget seeing broken Hennessy bottles on the CO parking lot of Rikers Island. Hey, that's none of my business, but it's there, right? And how is that impacting your decision making when you're trying to decide whether you should put me in solitary or not? So no, we both want the same thing, but the fear and the anger piece does get in the way because it's harm on both sides. And a great example is California. And that also means working with faith leaders. Faith leaders, like I told the majority leader a few hours ago, are in a unique position to hold our legislators accountable to the values that they say they stand for. Again, to create that cognitive dissonance, and one has to change the values that are action. And usually the actions change because values are hard to shape. They're kind of ingrained in us. And I'll tell you, it's been really great working with faith leaders because one of the things that actually kept me going through the time in solitary, and you can imagine I get that question a lot, was just really hope, the belief in things yet to be revealed, and the hope that I would get out, the hope that I would see my daughter, and so on and so forth, which I still try to make sense of to this day. Okay, I know we're running short on time, and I really did want to leave a whole lot of space open for questions, but it's running a little short. But let's not waste time talking about how much time we don't have. Let's talk. Anyone want to respond, react? Hand in the back there.
Yeah, I liked what you said about the kind of tense and difficult relationship between advocates and correctional staff.
Mhm.
And that's kind of a line that I balance in my work. We send tutors in to support educational classrooms in prisons.
Nice.
And so we are all, 80 of us here in Philly, are kind of on that line of complacency where we're working against the system but working inside of it. So I just wondering how you navigate that now as an advocate for somebody who goes back into the space that we're supposed to. Yeah,
it's funny for me being an advocate and also being formerly incarcerated advocate going inside the space, right? Like sometimes I come in, I will look like a lawyer, get treated as such, and then when I start speaking, right, it's hard for me to talk and not talk about the fact that I was away for 13 years of my life. And you literally see the emotional chemistry in the room shift. You see that a lot. I've never been disrespected or anything like that. But I think that the friction comes in when security, or for matters of security, a policy is passed or an accident has happened that conflicts with you as a person who's working in there. And social workers get this a lot, the dual loyalty piece. And what I always tell people in those cases, I think that any time you're strong on the side of truth and honesty, and where you believe in your heart to be right, to stand by that. I think that a lot of the neglect that I saw throughout my incarceration wasn't proactive. You get your ribs broken. But a lot of the personal neglect that I saw was actually, or a lot of the injustice, if you will, came as a result of neglect. Not looking out like that. The person who kept walking by his cell, he kept yelling, "I need insulin, I need insulin." Which I was like, "Guy's mentally ill. He doesn't know what he's talking about." And finally, one officer went to the sergeant, his ranking officer, "Hey, I don't know, this guy in 8 cells, you might look at him." He said, "Well, get out of here, don't come back here until there's a body." 2 weeks later, Barry Ballard died. Right? And now that sergeant's facing, punitive consequences. But I always wonder what would have happened if because one of the social workers would have said, "Hey, we need to do something about this, or speak up." And it's not easy. It's really not. It's really not. I yield my privilege as a person who comes in from the outside, who, hey, you don't pay me, so I'm not restricted by any of that. Not that I am, but so that, and then also having my truth as a person who's been formerly incarcerated. I know you're not going to say that that's what y'all do, because I know for a fact that's not what you do. In fact, I don't even want to talk to you. I'd rather talk to the man or to the person who's inside of the cell to get the real truth from them. And it's not an easy position. You have to challenge outwards and also challenge folks, internally. And then there's going to be battles that you have to choose. Mary Busser, who wrote the book Lockdown on Rikers, had to make that exact decision. Here she is. She is the chief mental health officer in the unit, and she saw so much damage being done. And she said, "I cannot, with good conscience, continue in this job." That cognitive dissonance, right? When the actions are so blatant that it conflicts with my values. And yes, I need a paycheck just like anybody else. We have to take care of ourselves. But at what point do I say, you know what? I cannot participate in this at all. And that's a difficult question to answer. Anyone else? Gentleman in the back there. Oh, wait, before I get to show, go ahead. Sorry.
You mentioned it several times, but it seems to me that at some point we have to directly confront the issue of punishment, and that punishment and justice cannot coexist, and that our system is a punishment system from the way we make laws, to the way police patrol, to how they decide who's bad how they then give them a record, so how school resources, I used to go to detention. Now I would go to jail if I were a kid. I mean, and at every stage, the alliance between prosecutors and judges, the nature of prison itself. I mean, it's all a punishment system.
Yes, 1,000 times, and I think that we're conscious of that, and because we have such a punitive paradigm, right? We're also in a space where we've criminalized mental health. Right? We've criminalized homelessness. I mean, I worked direct services for 3.5 years. I can tell you how many clients I had with $250 fines where they fell asleep on a park bench. Newsflash, if I'm sleeping on a park bench, you're not getting $250. Right? So, like, even just how backwards that is, right? We perpetually criminalize people. We say, hey, you did your time, but then in society we remind them every sense, these invisible fences. I was on parole for 5 years, where I literally couldn't fraternize with anyone who has a felony. But what happens when the entire family has a felony? What do I do? Well, right? So yeah, and I think that the answer is not necessarily. I'll say the answer to the end because I think that what you're bringing up is a question more of values and not necessarily of what policies. I think that once the culture changes, policies are followed in a lot of different ways. And one of the fascinating things that I saw with a lot of recent changes around same-sex marriage is that you saw this cultural change shift a whole lot earlier on. You see it in the TV or some TV shows, so on and so forth. You do see like that cultural shift before we actually saw the policies pass. Not that there wasn't any struggle, but when you look at throughout history, you see a number of different things, at least in movements throughout the last 100 years. You see people who were directly impacted leading that movement, saying, hey, I know what this looks like, and I know what harm looks like, and I know what justice and restoration looks like, and then you also, see, you see forward incarcerated leadership, and then you also see that culture change, like what needs to happen for us to change culturally and internally in order for us to actually pass the policies that we want to see. So when this question comes up about make the case for solitary, I can come up here and tell you all the statistics in the world and convince you that this is it, but you won't leave changed. So my question to you is not how do we get rid of solitary, but how do we change people?
Yes.
Right? How do we change people? And that's a deep question that I do not have the answer to. It almost brings tears to my eyes because I do not know how to do that, because I fundamentally think that we're not going to get to a place in this world where we don't have that punitive paradigm, right? Where we do see the capacity of people and the capacity for them to become the best version of themselves, if we don't make those internal changes, right? I've met funders who fund work around homelessness, but will get on the train and not give this guy $1. Think about it, right? It's about $100,000 to work on this issue. But you get on the train, and this person comes up to you with a cup, and you say, I ain't got it. Right? It doesn't fit. It doesn't fit. So the question is, how can we become better people? Or better yet, how can we behave as better people? Or how can we catalyze that in ourselves? How can we catalyze it within our families? Because we all got that one family member. I know I got one or two. So that's kind of backwards, Jim. That's kind of backwards, Johnny, or whatever name, fill in the blank, right? And how do we do that? And that's a question that's going to take a lot of work and challenging. And it's not easy. It takes uncomfortable conversations. Like many of you are not going to disagree with me with a lot of things that I say may challenge me a little bit, but it's not really hostile in here. Like we kind of get the punitive paradigm, so on and so forth. It's going to take conversations about racism, conversations about white privilege,
Yes.
conversations about wealth and inequity,
Yes.
but more importantly, conversations about privilege and how we leverage that privilege.
Yes. Yes.
Someone said, Johnny, you're very privileged. You don't know how privileged you are, right? You're traveling the country, you got a good job, you got shoes on your feet. And at the time, I actually got offended. How dare you? I did 13 years in prison. I'm a black man in society. I gotta put my camera on if I get pulled over. How dare you say I have privilege? And part of having privilege is that you sometimes don't know you have it. Right? Lo and behold, you don't know what you don't know. So of course I'm going to be defensive in some senses, right? But then the larger question, well, now that I know that I have it, what's the next question? So you say, what do I do with it? So I realized that, one of the true markings of a leader is to build other leaders and to create space for other people to step in. And there's some folks, I hope that y'all can hang on to us. Some folks here specifically from Pennsylvania working on this exact issue. Chris, can you put your hand up real quick? And whoever these folks, I'm not like outing anyone who's working on these issues. Salim is another brother who I actually look up to here in Pennsylvania who are leading these fights who and I admire Salim, actually specifically, I have to put you on the spot. But Salim, and I believe you've been, he was organizing on the inside long before starting organizing on the inside, on the outside, and in the unique perspectives of that, and it's not until we can recognize our privilege, leverage it, to amplify the voices of those who've been most harmed, to change the hearts and minds of those around us who may even not know that they also themselves have privilege, And then the other thing, the last thing that I always tell people is that you can get in spaces that I can't, So take me with you, in your heart, in your minds, and some of your feedback to people. Hey, I heard this guy Johnny. He didn't make a whole lot of sense, but he did say this one thing that made sense to me, And if you're able to do that, then you carry my message to them. Because sometimes it's not the message, but who, right? The messenger, Hence I try to tell corrections, hey, you want to fix gang problems? Hire former gang members, but they won't listen to me. But just reaction to the punitive piece, I think we have time for one more question, and then I'll hang out a little bit, and folks can ask questions, but I'll be respectful of people's time. Can we take just one more?
The footage of the private, the profiteering of the private prisons.
Yeah.
What can we do to counter that? It feels like something that I don't have any control over, but is it like?
Oh, you do. You have a whole lot of control over, yeah. Well, one, okay, pop quiz. Do you know what all your money in your 401ks were? Right, not you specifically, but a lot of us, right? We have 401ks. Do we know where these funds actually going? Or when they invest in mutual funds, that we know mutual funds are a group of other stocks. Where are these mutual funds coming from? Right, so that's a question to definitely ask your employer, because you don't want to inadvertently be supporting prisons with your retirement dollars.
Wow.
Right? Some say, hey, well, if they go up 500%, that actually is, I've heard that, So that's one question. And then also another question is that you'll be surprised how many products are made by men, women who are incarcerated. And how many services you use. You may pick up the phone and find out that your telemarketer is actually a person who's incarcerated. It's probably chained to his desk. So asking those questions. But I think the larger piece is that there's a legislator right now, somewhere in some office, saying that you want something you don't. Because we lack the capacity to be able to engage this legislator and say, hey, you're my legislator. I want to be able to come in and talk about exactly what it is that you care about. Make sure that you're representing my concerns. Where do you stand on this issue? Where do you stand on that issue? And I'm hopeful because it feels like we're in a place in our country where people have to respond to that. I look at Twitter every now and then, the conversation about should incarcerated people vote. Huge topic, right? And then, I'm not gonna say it's even, I don't know what that looks like. You can obviously know where I stand on that issue. Because I believe that everyone should have the right to vote. But we're in a place where presidential candidates have to respond to that. Mainly because the community is held them accountable. To the degree in which you can do that, of course. And then I always say, don't reinvent the wheel, support the work. Nonprofit work does not get done on its own. That's just the reality and truth of it. I wish we had a government that said, hey, we also need social justice issues and things like that, but we're actually seeing it stripped away in a whole different spaces, especially when we're talking about conditions work. Nobody cares about the people inside. Oh, they're all right. Let's keep them from going in and keep them from going back. But what do we do with the 95% or so that are out there now? So yeah. Last closing thought. I'm gonna put my contact information there, our website, social media, and two important websites: Solitary Watch, which if you don't know, you should totally check out, and the unlocktheboxnow.org. website. I put up there because it's a fairly new national campaign to end solitary in 20 years. Excuse me, by 2030. Let's see, 2030. And if something that I said, of course, definitely take it with you. You know, if you disagree with something that doesn't make sense, that's completely fine. You can also leave it here, or you can email me about it, and we can have a larger conversation. I'm totally always happy to do that. But more importantly, I think that the question that I really want y'all to take away from all of this is really asking yourself the question about who am I? What do I value? And if so, do these policies reflect that? And if not, to act. I don't care how eloquent I can be and so on and so forth. If you do not feel compelled to act. So I was hoping to create cognitive dissonance tonight and get you to change either your behaviors or even your values. Thank you so much.